Max and Daisy had always been together. From the moment the shelter staff found them as abandoned pups, shivering in the rain and huddled under an old, broken crate, they had been inseparable. Daisy had been the weaker of the two, barely more than a bundle of wet fur, but Max had kept her warm, shielding her with his larger frame. Even then, it was clear that Max wasn't just her brother. He was her protector, her guardian, and her world. The shelter had quickly become their new home, but it was far from perfect. The concrete floors were cold, and the endless barking of other dogs created an atmosphere of nervous tension. Despite this, Max and Daisy seemed to carve out their own little bubble of peace. Each night, they curled up together in the corner of their kennel, their noses touching as if drawing strength from one another. Max was the quieter of the two, watchful and cautious. His golden brown eyes always seemed to be scanning the world, wary of potential threats. Daisy, on the other hand, was a bundle of boundless optimism. Her floppy ears perked up at the sound of footsteps, and her tail wagged energetically every time someone passed their kennel. She had a way of looking at people that melted hearts. Head slightly tilted, her brown eyes wide with curiosity and hope. The shelter staff had a soft spot for the pair. They loved how Daisy brought out Max's softer side, coaxing him to play or lick her face when he thought no one was watching. These two were something special, one of the workers, Karen, often said. It's like they were made for each other. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months, and still, Max and Daisy remained at the shelter. Visitors came and went, many stopping to admire the pair. But time after time, they moved on, choosing younger puppies or more outgoing dogs. Max's cautious demeanor didn't help. He often hung back, letting Daisy take the spotlight. Daisy didn't mind. She was always eager to make a new friend, wagging her tail and pressing her nose against the bars. Then, one crisp autumn morning, everything changed. The shelter door swung open, and in walked a young family, a mother, father, and their little girl, Emily. The parents looked around with interest, but it was Emily who led the way, her bright eyes scanning the rows of kennels. She was clutching a stuffed animal in one hand and bouncing with excitement. "Can we see them all, please?" she asked, her voice full of enthusiasm. Karen greeted them with a warm smile. "Of course. Are you looking for anything in particular?" Emily's father chuckled. "We're just here to meet the dogs, but something small and friendly would be great. Our first pet." Karen's eyes lit up. "I think I know just the ones," she said, leading them down the row of kennels. "This is Daisy," she announced, stopping in front of Max and Daisy's kennel. "And that's her brother, Max." Daisy, as always, was the first to approach. She pressed her nose to the bars, her tail wagging so hard it made her whole body wiggle. Emily gasped in delight and crouched down, holding out her hand. "Hi, Daisy," she said softly. Daisy sniffed her fingers, then licked them, her tail wagging even faster. Max stayed back, watching from the shadows. His ears perked up, but he didn't move closer. Emily noticed him and tilted her head. "What about him?" she asked. Karen smiled gently. "That's Max. He's a little shy, but he's a sweetheart once he gets to know you. He and Daisy are very close." Emily reached her hand toward Max, but he didn't budge. Instead, he glanced at Daisy, as if looking for reassurance. Daisy barked softly, turning back to him for a moment before returning her attention to Emily. It was as if she was saying, "It's okay. She's nice." Emily's parents exchanged a glance. "Daisy seems perfect," her mother said. "She's friendly, great with kids. What do you think, honey?" Emily nodded eagerly. "I love her. Can we take her home today?" Karen's smile faltered just a little. "Of course," she said, opening the kennel door. Daisy bounded out, her tail wagging furiously. But Max stayed where he was, his golden eyes fixed on Daisy with a look of confusion and concern. As Karen led Daisy toward the adoption area, Max moved to the front of the kennel, pressing his nose against the bars. He let out a soft whine, a sound that seemed to echo in the quiet hallway. Emily stopped and turned, noticing Max's sad expression. "What about Max?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Her father knelt beside her. "Taking care of one dog will be a big responsibility. he explained. We can't take both, but they're together, Emily said, her brow furrowing. He looked sad. Karen knelt down to Emily's level. Max will be okay, she said gently. We'll make sure he finds a good home, too. Emily hesitated, but her parents gently guided her toward the adoption desk. As the paperwork was filled out, Daisy wagged her tail and leaned into Emily's touch. But every now and then, she glanced back toward the kennel where Max was waiting. When the time came to leave, Daisy hesitated. Her paws skidded on the floor as Karen gently tugged the leash. Max let out a louder whine, pawing at the bars. Daisy turned, her eyes locking with Max's one last time before the door closed behind her. Back in the kennel, Max sank to the floor. He pressed his nose against the spot where Daisy had lain, letting out a low, mournful cry. The other dogs barked around him, but he didn't seem to notice. For the first time, he was alone. That night, the shelter was unusually quiet. The staff walked past Max's kennel, pausing to check on him, but he didn't move. His food bowl sat untouched, and his golden eyes were fixed on the door as if willing Daisy to walk through it. The bond they had shared, the connection that had kept them both strong, had been severed. And for Max, the world had never felt lonelier. Max's days without Daisy passed in a blur of silence and stillness. Where once the kennel had been a place of warmth and companionship, it now felt unbearably empty. Max had always been the quieter of the two, but now he barely made a sound. He lay in the corner of his kennel, his head resting on the cold floor, his eyes fixed on the door. Every time footsteps echoed in the hallway, his ears would perk up for a brief moment, only to droop again when Daisy didn't appear. The shelter staff noticed the change immediately. He hasn't eaten in 2 days, Karen said, her voice heavy with concern as she spoke to a coworker. He just lies there all day. I've never seen him like this. They tried everything to lift his spirits. Karen brought him Daisy's favorite rope toy, hoping the familiar scent might comfort him. Max sniffed it once, his nose twitching slightly, but then he turned away. A volunteer sat with him for hours, offering treats and soft words, but Max showed no interest. Even during walks, which he once enjoyed, he moved slowly, his head hanging low, as if the world outside the kennel no longer held any joy. He's grieving, Karen said one evening as she cleaned his kennel. I've seen dogs go through this before when they lose their companions, but it's never easy to watch. Meanwhile, Daisy's new life was everything a dog could dream of. Her days were filled with playtime, cuddles, and love. Emily adored her, spending hours running around the yard with her, throwing balls for her to fetch, and teaching her tricks. Daisy quickly learned to sit, shake paws, and even roll over, earning enthusiastic cheers and belly rubs from her new family. She had a warm bed by the fireplace and a toy basket that was never empty. But even in the midst of her happiness, Daisy seemed to sense that something was missing. Every evening, when the house grew quiet, she would pick up the rope toy Max had played with during their time at the shelter. She carried it to her bed, holding it gently in her mouth as she lay down to sleep. Sometimes, she would sit by the window, staring out into the dark yard, her ears flicking at the faint sounds of the world beyond. Emily noticed these moments and asked her mother about them. I think she misses her brother, her mother said, watching Daisy rest her head on the windowsill. They were together for so long. It's only natural. Can we get him too? Emily asked hopefully. He could come live with us. Her mother smiled gently. 2 dogs are a lot of work, sweetheart. Let's make sure Daisy is settled first. Emily nodded, but she couldn't stop thinking about Max. She had seen the sadness in his eyes that day at the shelter, the way he had watched Daisy leave. It made her chest feel tight, and she couldn't help but wonder if he was okay. Back at the shelter, Max's condition didn't improve. He grew thinner as he continued to refuse food, and the once soft sheen of his coat became dull. The staff tried moving him to a different kennel, one with more sunlight, but it made no difference. Max simply lay there, his head resting on the floor, his golden eyes distant and unfocused. One afternoon, Karen sat outside his kennel, watching him with a heavy heart. We have to do something, she said to another worker. He's not going to make it like this. The worker nodded. What can we do? We can't bring Daisy back. Karen thought for a moment. What if we reached out to Daisy's new family? Maybe if they knew how much he's struggling, they'd consider adopting him too. It was a long shot, but Karen decided to try. She pulled up Daisy's adoption file and found the family's contact information. Later that evening, she called them. Daisy's new mom answered the phone, and Karen explained the situation, her voice tinged with urgency. "We don't mean to pressure you," Karen said, "but Max and Daisy were incredibly close. He's been having a really hard time since she left. If there's any chance you might consider taking him too, it could mean everything to him." Daisy's mom hesitated. "That's a lot to ask," she said thoughtfully. "We love Daisy, but adding another dog wasn't part of the plan." Karen nodded, even though the woman couldn't see her. "I understand," she said. "Just think about it. And if you can't, maybe you know someone who might be willing to adopt him. He needs a home where he can feel safe again." After the call, Karen felt a flicker of hope. But days passed, and there was no word from Daisy's family. Max remained withdrawn, his tail motionless even when the staff brought him outside to the yard. The other dogs barked and played around him, but Max didn't join in. He sat by the fence, staring out at the world beyond it, as if waiting for Daisy to come back. Unknown to Karen, Daisy's family had been thinking about Max. Emily, especially, couldn't get him out of her mind. She brought it up every night at dinner. "He's all alone, Mom," she said one evening, her voice trembling. "I know Daisy is happy here, but what if Max is really sad? What if he thinks she's never coming back?" Her mother sighed, glancing at her husband. "She's got a point," she admitted. "And Daisy does seem to miss him. She carries that toy everywhere." Emily's dad rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It's not like we don't have the space," he said finally. "And he's an older dog, so it's not like we'll have to go through all the puppy training again." Emily's eyes lit up. "Does that mean we can get him?" Her dad smiled. "It means we'll think about it. Let's call the shelter tomorrow and ask more questions." Emily could barely contain her excitement. But that night, as Daisy curled up by the fireplace with Max's rope toy, she couldn't help but imagine what it would be like to have them both together again. The thought filled her with a warm sense of hope, and for the first time since they had brought Daisy home, she felt like their family might still be missing a piece. At the shelter, Max lay in his kennel, unaware that somewhere, someone was thinking of him. The days felt long and empty, but in the quiet moments, he still dreamed of Daisy. And even though he didn't know it, hope was on the horizon. The story of Max and Daisy had touched more hearts than anyone at the shelter could have anticipated. When Karen had shared their story on the shelter's social media page, she had hoped it might encourage someone to adopt Max. She wrote about their bond, their inseparable companionship, and the pain Max had been experiencing since Daisy's adoption. What she didn't expect was for the post to go viral. Within days, the post had garnered thousands of likes, shares, and comments. People from all over the country were moved by Max's story. Some shared their own tales of adopting bonded animals, while others simply expressed their heartbreak for Max. Offers to adopt him came flooding in, but Karen was careful. She didn't just want to find a home for Max. She wanted the perfect match, someone who would understand the depth of his loss and his need for patience and care. Amid the influx of attention, one comment stood out. A man named Jack had written, "I lost my dog a year ago, and my house has felt empty ever since. I've been looking for a companion, and Max's story touched me deeply. I'd love to meet him and give him the love he deserves." Jack's words resonated with Karen. She reached out to him, and they spoke over the phone. Jack's voice was warm and steady, and his sincerity was evident as he talked about his experience with dogs. "I understand loss," he said, his voice soft. "It's not something you can rush through. If Max needs time, I'll give him all the time he needs." Karen arranged for Jack to visit the shelter the following weekend. When the day arrived, Jack walked in with a quiet confidence, carrying a bag of treats in one hand and a blanket in the other. His eyes softened as he approached Max's kennel, where the dog lay curled in his usual spot. Max glanced up briefly, but then lowered his head again, uninterested. Karen unlocked the kennel door and let Jack step inside. "He's been like this for weeks," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "But he'll come around. He just needs someone who's willing to wait." Jack nodded and crouched down, staying a respectful distance from Max. He didn't try to coax him over or force an interaction. Instead, He sat cross-legged on the cold floor, setting the blanket beside him. "Hey there, Max," he said quietly. His voice was low and calm, without a hint of urgency. "I'm not here to bother you. Just thought we could hang out for a bit." For the first few minutes, Max didn't move. Jack sat patiently, his hands resting on his knees, occasionally glancing at Max, but mostly letting the dog observe him. Slowly, Max's ears flicked in Jack's direction. His eyes lifted slightly, taking in the stranger who didn't seem to want anything from him. Jack stayed for nearly an hour that day, not saying much, just sitting with Max and tossing a treat toward him every now and then. By the time he left, Max had inched slightly closer, though he still kept his distance. It was a small step, but for Max, it was significant. Jack returned the next day, and the day after that. Each time, he brought the same quiet presence, the same patience. He never pushed Max to come closer, instead allowing the dog to approach on his own terms. By the end of the week, Max had begun to sit up when Jack arrived. He even accepted a treat directly from his hand, a gesture that made Karen smile for the first time in days. "It's working," she said to Jack after his fourth visit. "I haven't seen him this responsive since Daisy left." Jack nodded, his face calm but hopeful. "It's all about trust," he said. "You can't rush a bond like this." Over the next 2 weeks, Max grew more comfortable around Jack. He started wagging his tail faintly when Jack arrived, and one day, he even leaned his head into Jack's hand for a brief moment. Karen watched from a distance, her heart swelling with hope. It was clear that Max was beginning to trust Jack, and she knew it was time to discuss adoption. When Jack sat down with Karen to finalize the paperwork, he asked an unexpected question. "What about Daisy?" he said. "I've read so much about their bond. Is there any way they could meet again?" Karen hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "Daisy's family has been wonderful," she said. "They've reached out a few times to check on Max, and I know they've thought about him. But I'm not sure if they'd be open to a reunion." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "If there's a chance, I'd like to try. Even if they can't be together permanently, I think it would mean a lot to Max to see her again." Karen agreed to reach out to Daisy's family. To her surprise, they were open to the idea. "We've been thinking about Max a lot," Daisy's mom said over the phone. "Emily talks about him all the time. She's been asking if we can arrange a playdate." With plans in motion, Jack prepared to take Max home. On the day of the adoption, he brought Max a new leash and collar, along with a soft bed for his crate. Max seemed hesitant, but allowed Jack to lead him out of the shelter for the first time. Karen watched them leave with tears in her eyes, knowing Max was finally on his way to a better life. But before Jack took Max to his new home, he had one more stop to make. The reunion with Daisy had been arranged for that same afternoon, and as Jack drove to Daisy's house, Max sat quietly in the back seat. His eyes scanned the passing scenery, and though he didn't understand where they were going, there was a faint spark of curiosity in his gaze. When they pulled into the driveway of Daisy's home, Max's ears perked up. He sniffed the air, his tail twitching slightly as Jack opened the door. Jack led him up the front steps and knocked gently. The door opened, and there she was, Daisy, her tail wagging furiously, her body practically vibrating with excitement. Max froze. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, staring at Daisy as if he couldn't believe his eyes. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he lunged forward, letting out a joyful bark. Daisy bounded toward him, her tail whipping back and forth as she licked his face and nuzzled against him. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered joy. Max's tail wagged so hard it thumped against Jack's leg, and for the first time in weeks, the light returned to his eyes. Daisy barked excitedly, circling Max and tugging playfully at his ear. The two of them seemed to pick up right where they had left off, as if no time had passed at all. For Jack, watching the reunion was a confirmation of everything he had hoped for. Max was no longer the sad, withdrawn dog he had met at the shelter. In that moment, he was whole again, and though their journey together was just beginning, Jack knew that Max's heart was finally on the mend. Max and Daisy's reunion was nothing short of magical. For the first time in weeks, Max's somber demeanor melted away, replaced by unbridled joy. Daisy's excitement was contagious as she circled Max, barking happily and tugging at his ears with the same playful energy she had shown when they were together at the shelter. Max responded with gentle nuzzles, letting out soft, joyful whines that sounded like a dog's version of laughter. The two dogs were oblivious to their human spectators, who stood off to the side, blinking back tears. Emily, clutching her stuffed animal, was the first to break the silence. "They're so happy," she exclaimed, her voice filled with wonder. Jack nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. "They really are. It's like they've never been apart." Daisy's parents had been uncertain about how the reunion would go. They had worried that the time apart might have created a distance between the two dogs, or that Max, still recovering from his heartbreak, might not be ready. But watching the way the two greeted each other, as though no time had passed, melted all their doubts away. After several minutes of joyful chaos, Max and Daisy settled into a rhythm. They stood side by side, sniffing the yard together, their tails wagging in perfect harmony. Daisy darted toward the toy basket on the porch, retrieving the frayed rope toy they had shared at the shelter. She dropped it at Max's feet, looking up at him expectantly. Max picked it up carefully, giving it a gentle tug as Daisy grabbed the other end. It was as if they had never left their old life behind. Jack crouched down, calling softly to Max. The dog paused, looking back at Jack with an expression that seemed almost conflicted. Daisy barked once, wagging her tail encouragingly, and Max trotted over to Jack, still holding the rope toy. Jack scratched behind Max's ears, his voice full of reassurance. "It's okay, buddy," he said. "You're not losing her again." Jack's words were more than a promise. They were a plan. Over the past week, Jack and Daisy's family had been talking, exploring ways to keep the two dogs connected despite living in separate homes. While adopting Max wasn't an option for Daisy's family, they simply didn't have the capacity for a second dog. They were deeply committed to ensuring that the siblings could remain a part of each other's lives. The idea of regular playdates was an easy decision. Daisy's family had a spacious yard, perfect for running and playing, while Jack's home had a quieter, more secluded environment where Max could unwind. Between the two, they could provide the best of both worlds for the dogs. The first playdate stretched well into the evening. Max and Daisy ran laps around the yard, chased each other through the bushes, and wrestled in the grass until their energy finally began to wane. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the yard, the two dogs lay side by side beneath a tree, their tongues lolling out as they panted contentedly. Emily sat cross-legged a few feet away, her eyes fixed on the pair. "Do you think they remember everything?" she asked, looking up at her mom. "I think so," her mother replied, sitting beside her. "Dogs don't forget the ones they love. Do you think they're happy now?" Emily asked again, her voice softer this time. Her mother smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face. "Look at them. What do you think?" Emily followed her mother's gaze. Max had rested his head on Daisy's back, and Daisy, in turn, nuzzled closer to him. Emily grinned. "I think they're really happy." As the evening came to an end, it was time for Max to leave with Jack. When Jack clipped the leash on Max's collar, Daisy's ears perked up. She stood, watching as Max was led toward the car. For a moment, she looked as though she might follow, her tail wagging hesitantly. "It's okay, Daisy," Emily said, crouching down to pet her. "You'll see him again soon." Daisy tilted her head, seeming to understand, and sat obediently. Jack knelt beside Max before helping him into the car. "We'll be back," he said softly, looking over his shoulder at Daisy. "This isn't goodbye." Jack drove home with Max, who seemed unusually relaxed. As they pulled into the driveway of Jack's house, Max stepped out of the car and sniffed the air. The home was quiet, a sharp contrast to the lively yard he had just left, but Max didn't seem to mind. For the first time since Daisy's adoption, he seemed at peace. Inside, Jack showed Max around the house. There was a cozy dog bed waiting for him near the fireplace, along with a new collection of toys. Max sniffed everything cautiously before settling down on the bed with a contented sigh. Jack sat beside him, running a hand through his fur. "We'll make this work," Jack said. "You got a family now. 2 families, actually." Over the next few weeks, Max and Daisy fell into their new routine. The playdates became a highlight of their lives, with Jack and Daisy's family coordinating their schedules to ensure the siblings saw each other as often as possible. Max's health improved dramatically. His coat regained its shine, and he began eating heartily again. At the same time, Daisy seemed more at ease, her playful energy even more infectious when Max was around. The two families grew close as well. Jack often stayed for dinner after dropping Max off, and Emily adored him, listening intently as he told stories about Max's progress and adventures. What had started as a shared effort to care for two dogs became a genuine friendship, with both families united by the love they had for Max and Daisy. One sunny afternoon, during yet another playdate, Emily's dad looked out at the yard where Max and Daisy were chasing each other in circles. "You know," he said, turning to Jack, "I think they've got it all figured out." Jack laughed. "They're smarter than we are, that's for sure." As the two families watched Max and Daisy play, it became clear that the dogs had found a balance. They had separate homes, separate routines, but their bond remained as strong as ever. And for everyone involved, their story was a reminder of the enduring power of love and connection, whether it was between siblings, families, or the dogs who had brought them all together. Max and Daisy's journey wasn't just about loss and reunion. It was about healing, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that can weather even the hardest of times. For Max, the world no longer felt empty. He had a home, a family, and, most importantly, Daisy. And for Daisy, every day was a new adventure, made even better by the knowledge that her brother was always just a playdate away.